Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work for social justice.
Each week, we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
Yes, sir. We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, it sounds like you're feeling a little bit better.
Yeah,
just great.
Progress.
That's good. You're also up this week, my friend.
Yep.
What have you brought to the table today?
Well, as the philosopher Batman says, the night is darkest before the dawn. I got sicker before I got better. So here we are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Good. I'm glad.
Yep.
Carry on, Batman.
Feeling better. Sounding a little less like Batman.
Yes.
And a little less like this podcast is on a late night radio program.
Okay.
But for the article that I'm bringing,
Yeah.
as I mentioned last week, it's by Peniel Joseph, and it's called The Revolution Never Ended. And it's from the Atlantic's new issue, which is called To Reconstruct the Nation. It features 9 articles and a play, which I thought was cool. I want to go back and read that.
Yes.
It's the first time in 100 years, I think they said, that the Atlantic had published a play.
Wow.
Which is,
That's so cool.
kind of nuts.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of really great history in this article and explores the way that Black people kept the project of Reconstruction alive in the face of the people who Dr. Joseph calls the redemptionists,
Yes.
who were dedicated to the lost cause of the South, which really meant that, quote, defeat did nothing to diminish its moral superiority, meaning the moral superiority of the South or the perceived superiority. And Dr. Joseph says that, quote, the work of Reconstruction never ended because the goal of a multiracial democracy has never been fully realized.
Right.
So in this framework, it's Reconstructionists who believed in the potential of a multiracial democracy grounded in the freedom of all people, and the Redemptionists who clung to the idea that white people were superior. And the article goes into parts of the story of Ida B. Wells, mentions Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, and how their work all connects to the continued project of Reconstruction, even after the federal government gave up on it.
Yes.
So there's a ton of stuff in here. Where do you want to start? What do you want to talk about?
Yeah, this was a really incredible piece. I'm so glad you found it. I'm also really glad to know about this play. I didn't realize it was a play. I was just interested in reading all of the other pieces from this December issue from The Atlantic. I hope we get to all of them because this one was incredible.
Yeah.
This piece really, I think, leaned into this idea that the mission and vision of Reconstruction is still alive and necessary, right?
Yeah.
And I particularly appreciated how Dr. Joseph showcased this through sharing some of the history of Reconstruction, the writings about Reconstruction, this incredible timeline of this work, sort of as the context, or as you say, like the framework. So that was all great. One of the quotes I loved in this piece about what Black Reconstructionists were able to do in sort of the aftermath of the Civil War was this, quote, Black Reconstructionists told the country a new story about itself. These were people who believed in freedom beyond emancipation. They shared an expansive vision of a compassionate nation with a true democratic ethos, right? And I don't know, I loved that quote. To me, it served as a reminder that despite how bad things are, how bad things may be, how much there is to overcome, what people have been through, and in this case, we're talking about the end of the Civil War, we're talking about years and years of slavery and mistreatment of anyone who wasn't white in this country. Mm-hmm. Despite all of that, there were always just really incredibly brave people doing organizing work, working, fighting for better, right? Working to create and achieve the society, the democracy, the institutions that serve all of us in the ways that we need and that we deserve and that treat us with dignity. I loved that quote. And as you sort of say, the quote you pulled, we haven't fully achieved those dreams of those Black Reconstructionists, but that quote to me was particularly powerful. And I hope it is for others engaged in this work. Like, to me, some of what I think this piece is and can be is this idea of a beacon of hope for folks engaged in this work. So yeah, I loved this piece.
Yeah, it's really great, and he goes through a lot of different stuff, which
Yes.
was cool to learn, even
Yeah.
just snippets of.
Right. A lot of history too. Yeah.
Yeah, and so one of the things that stood out to me, speaking of history, is some of the history of Mississippi. So it's a state that I know has a violent history and continues to have violence into today.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of structural violence too. You think about Jackson, Mississippi not having clean water in a lot of places there.
Right.
Those kind of things. But I didn't know about this brief moment when there was a white governor who was elected because he stood for equality for all, and he wanted Mississippi to stand for that. And his Secretary of State and his Superintendent of Education were both black men, and there were 69 black men serving in the Mississippi legislature. So all of that, you know, I just didn't know about
I
it in
didn't either.
Mississippi, and
Incredible.
it's great to know that now.
Yes.
And it also makes, I think, the collapse then of Reconstruction all the more tragic.
Right.
In some ways, because, you know, all of that collapsed because the federal government was like, nah, we're going to pull troops from these places in the South, which allowed for white vigilantes to murder black folks and push everything backwards towards the white redemptionist control.
Right.
You know, this is also when like the Klan starts popping up and all kinds of things like that. Really focus on a campaign of terror across the South for black folks who were trying to live the promise of Reconstruction, and it collapsed in the wake of the federal government giving up. Rutherford B. Hayes was the president at the time, and the white backlash of violence that came in the aftermath of the withdrawal of troops throughout the South.
Yeah, that was incredible to learn about. Like, I also did not know about that. And to think about that moment in time as being this promise for folks down there must have felt and been incredible for the time period that it lasted. But then things went south in really awful ways. And I think that's one of the other things that I so appreciated about this piece was this history and Dr. Joseph's use of history to illustrate this. You mentioned Ida B. Wells. I thought one of the best parts of this piece was his use of her life, her legacy to illustrate what all of this looked like in practice and in many ways still does, and what it means to be engaged in this work. And in particular, I think, and we've talked about this before, to do this work in spite of the tremendous threat that it presents to you personally.
Right.
And everything going on around you as you look around what's happening in Mississippi at the time. And so he talked about lots of incredible folks, but I thought the use of her story, her work, her life was particularly moving and a great way to illustrate all of this, because I thought one of the main points that he was trying to make about her story and her work was, you know, she helped to really keep the mission and vision of Reconstruction alive for so long and helped it be central to the fabric of our country at the time and influenced so many of those folks, like you mentioned, in this work as well. And so I pulled this quote that Dr. Joseph said about Ida B. Wells in this piece. And, you know, he talked about how through her writings, through her speeches, she, quote, told America a story it needed but did not want to hear.
Yeah.
And that's so true when you sort of take the totality of the body of her work and you look at everything that she did. That was the work that she was engaged in, and that felt important to her despite those challenges, despite those threats, despite the, you know, everything that was going on at the time. Like, that work was so important. And so the sharing of her story was multiple paragraphs of this piece. And I think there's so much to learn from Ida B. Wells and her story. So it was great to have it here.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that she really did was tell those stories, as you said, that we needed to hear.
Yes.
In ways that mainstream journalism at the time was failing at.
Yes. Oh,
and in some ways still is failing at doing by framing stories in a misleading way.
Right.
So there's this story about 3 black men being killed by a white mob in Memphis. They were named Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart. And they were killed because they stood up to a white mob that were outside of Thomas Moss's grocery store that he owned, which was seen as encroaching on a white-owned grocery store nearby. And so it sort of turned into a turf war kind of thing. But the way that the white-owned paper in Memphis talked about this violence was really a way to justify the violence. So Dr. Joseph says, quote, "The Memphis Appeal Avalanche documented the horrors as fair justice for the troublesome black men who had dared to fight white men." And that feels so relevant to today in how we hear and receive news stories.
Yes.
like when the police's record of events is taken at their word, not fact checked, or when right-wing media conglomerates own the news, like Sinclair Broadcasting,
yeah.
and they present their view of things. But my point here being that Reconstruction isn't just about how our government institutions need to continue to be reconstructed, but all institutions, independent media, everything that touches our lives in some way needs to continue to be revisited with this Reconstruction lens.
Yes.
That is more equitable and more inclusive and more just than the things and the way that we've been doing things.
Absolutely. That's such a good point. Yeah, and all of the work that she did throughout sort of the media that she touched or worked with, I thought was so powerful and incredible to get the truth and out there to anyone who could read it. And so, yeah, I appreciate the idea of thinking about the lens in which we need to be evaluating things and improving them to meet the time. One of the other pieces that stood out to me, and I think it's kind of related to what you just talked about, is just how important it is to acknowledge like this notion of evolution. And so one of Dr. Joseph's major points from this piece is this idea that Reconstruction has never stopped. It's only evolved. But he goes on to make this point that we also have to acknowledge that the same is true. The same applies to the other side, the redemptionist, as you talked about. He sort of coined this term. He mentioned and referenced things like the reaction to and the outlash in the aftermath of the election of President Barack Obama, at the election of Trump, and what that did to this country, police violence leading up to the summer of 2020, book bans, like the changing of curriculums across the country in our schools. And we've talked here about on the podcast about things like right-wing governors, like fascism, the impact of institutions, speaking of institutions, like the Supreme Court. And so Dr. Joseph's point here is that the work of Reconstruction has continued and evolved, and it's had to do that because the other side has evolved as well. And so I appreciated him naming that and talking about it because it's an important piece of this puzzle. And as you say, we have to think about that as it relates to all aspects of our society.
Yeah, and I think that the way he points that out is so great.
Yeah.
Because it's just like Reconstruction has to continue.
Yes.
It's never really stopped, which brings me to application.
Hey.
So let's talk about how we can apply this article to our day-to-day lives. My application really foregrounds into the modern day, really moves into the modern day.
Okay.
Is a better way to say that. How can we learn from the ways that Black people mentioned in this article kept pushing for the values that the federal government gave up on? Because so many people are doing that now in the streets and calling their congresspeople and in their neighborhoods. So Dr. Joseph said, quote, "The health of American democracy continues to rest upon whether we believe the Reconstructionist or the redemptionist version of history." Reconstruction as a belief, as an ideal, outlasted the federal government's political commitments by decades. Black people, the country's most improbable architects, continued to make and shape history by preserving this rich legacy and bequeathing it to their children. Their story has remained the heart of American experiment, both when the country has acknowledged them and most especially when it has not.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned in the beginning, we've never really realized that multiracial democracy that Reconstruction envisioned post-enslavement. And so the work has to continue, and we all have some kind of a role to play in that continued project, no matter where we sit or where we find ourselves in the greater sort of scheme of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about this idea of reckoning with our history and reckoning from our actual history. So I love that application. Mine's sort of similar. This idea that, I think the big takeaway for me is this idea that this work is not over. The work of Reconstruction is not over. It continues. And in so many ways, it's the work of abolitionists and folks who believe in abolitionist principles who are carrying the torch now. And so I think it's so critically important to not lose the fact that the work today is connected to the work of the past. And so one of the quotes I pulled from the piece, Dr. Joseph says, quote, "Today's Reconstructionists have a vision for a multiracial democracy that might astonish even Douglass, Wells, and Du Bois. Black women, queer folk, poor people, disabled people, prisoners, and formerly incarcerated people have adopted the term abolition from Du Bois' idea of abolition democracy and now use it to refer to a broad movement to dismantle interlocking systems of oppression, many of which originated in redemption policy. They have achieved important victories in taking down Confederate monuments, sharing a more accurate telling of America's origin story and its relationship to slavery, and questioning systems of punishment, surveillance, and poverty. And so, while the work, I think, has adapted to meet these ever-changing, like daily changing needs and challenges of our society, right? It's still all connected to history. It's important to continue to learn that history, tell those stories, talk about it with folks, and use it as we keep moving forward. To me, that was sort of the biggest application and takeaway from this.
Yeah, it's always changing and evolving of what we need to be able to do and take care of. And I think, our understanding of it also continues to grow. Our understanding of what it is that we need continues to grow.
Right.
You list all the people who are included in that, and not that long ago, not all those people would have been included in that list.
100%.
So yeah, that's great. Well, let's talk about homework. How do we want to continue to learn about this beyond our conversation today? The first thing I'm going to do is the easy thing is we should read the book. That's so easy. It might be cheating.
I know.
But we should read it. It's called The Third Reconstruction. It's Dr. Peniel Joseph's full-length book on the subject and how it ties into the modern demands for what could be considered a reconstruction, which we have talked about.
Yes.
And another is to just generally learn more about Reconstruction. An example would be the Mississippi history I talked about.
Yes.
Because I think it's written off frequently as a failed era of experiments. But there was a lot of progress made before Rutherford B. Hayes was elected and decided to pull the troops out of the South. So how would our country and culture here in the U.S. look if the government hadn't just given up?
That's such a huge question.
It's such an interesting thing to consider how much different things might be.
Right.
But yeah, what about you?
Yeah. So I love that. My continued learning, my homework was, there were so many incredible books and pieces that are mentioned in this piece. And so I think we just need to do more reading and more learning, right?
Yeah.
Ida B. Wells wrote for the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight and the New York Age magazines. And so those would be really great pieces to, her work in those magazines, I should say, would be great to read. There are lots of books. There's a book called Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, 1863 to 1877 by Eric Forner. That looks really good. There's a book called A Nation Under Our Feet by Stephen Hahn, which is really a well-known, well-renowned book. Of course, Black Reconstruction by Du Bois. And absolutely, we need to read Dr. Joseph's book. And so I think everything that he referenced was so good. And he pulled quotes from, and he talked about that history and the timeline and its influence on today's work. And so I want us to keep reading.
Yeah. I mean, that's always the thing.
Yes.
Just keep reading stuff.
Keep learning. Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think that's it for our conversation today.
All right.
And you're up next time, Damien. So what are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yes. All right. So for our next episode, I'm going to be bringing our November book to the table for us to talk about. And yes, folks, we're going to be talking about our November book in December because life happened and that's how it's going to be. But it's all right. We've been reading it. We're excited about it. The book is called Class Struggle Unionism. It was written by Joe Burns. It just came out last year and was published by our friends over at Haymarket Books. So, we love them. We love reading their stuff. And I was excited to choose this book in particular for us because I've really enjoyed all of the learning work we've done around unions, class, and the like. And so this book felt like a great way for us to continue that work. I pulled two parts of the description from Haymarket Books' website about this book, which I think will be a good intro for our discussion. So here it is. For those who want to build a fighting labor movement, there are many questions to answer. How to relate to the union establishment, which often does not want to fight. Whether to work in the rank and file of unions or staff jobs. How much to prioritize broader class demands versus shop floor struggle. How to relate to foundation-funded worker centers and alternative union efforts. And most critically, how can we revive militancy and union power in the face of corporate power and a legal system set up against us? Mm-hmm. Drawing on years of labor activism and study of labor tradition, Joe Burns outlines the key set of ideas common to class struggle unionism and shows how these ideas can create a more militant, democratic, and fighting labor movement. So yeah, so far it's been really powerful in terms of understanding some of the key terms, sort of the evolution of unionism and union work, and I'm excited to finish it. I'm excited for us to talk about it next time.
Yeah, me too. It's been a great read so far, and really illuminating to me as he really lays out the differences between the different kinds of unions that I think a lot of people are aware of.
Yes.
And how they are maybe not as progressive as we sort of think they are.
Yes.
And the ways that the different frameworks for what unionism could be, how those things operate and how they exist. It's been really interesting to have those sort of philosophies juxtaposed as he's talking
Yes.
about what it is that unionism could and should be.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
yeah, looking forward to talking about that right here next week.
Very good.
All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what we want you to do, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share a podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, check us out on YouTube, sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next time.